Hello friends, it's been a little while, but I'm back and giving you my top 10 books of 2024, better late than never. I'm wearing this bootleg merchandise, the Kaleidoscope shirt that my mother-in-law made for me. There you go. Anyway, let's get started. Number 10 is The Letters and Drawings of Bruno Schulz. Look at that. Now, I don't read letters by authors very often, but it was the drawings that I flipped through and looked at in the bookstore that made me want to go for it. And also, I had been enjoying a lot of nonfiction, so I thought, why not continue the trend? So, these drawings feature a kind of circus-like caricature with the men. They have huge heads, and then the women are drawn more realistically, sensually, and there's often a kind of Tarantino foot fetish domination going on that I don't know if I can share without being banned, but I'm trying to find a good example here that's rated semi-G. Okay, look at this. These are kind of like these dark, lecherous fairy tale drawings that I haven't really encountered before. And then here's an example of the big-headed individuals. As for the letters themselves, well, I guess I should preface it by saying I've read Street of Crocodiles. I wasn't blown away by it. It was some decent purple prose, but altogether the collection, I think, didn't come together very strongly. It also seemed almost like juvenilia, an author who had a lot of potential that was cut short. He was killed on the streets by a Nazi. But the letters, they get better and better. They're like almost 100 years old, some of them. And yet he's talking about writerly artistic struggles that even now is something that I and others, I think, could relate to. And then even as it's going into World War II and just the whole looming doomsday of it all, he sort of sinks more and more into his fanciful, imaginative world. The art kind of, I think, saved him on a mental level, even though he was eventually a victim of that tragic time period in history. But fascinating stuff. Even if you didn't care for his fiction, I would recommend this. But if you do love his fiction, then I would recommend this even more. Next is Abel Fassé's A Long Day in Venice. I actually interviewed Abel shortly before his death, about a year or so before his death, and was trying to help him to get reprints of his English translated books. He only has 2 that were translated into English a couple decades ago or so and are out of print. Phenomenal stuff. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that, and so I guess the rights are even more up in the air than they already were, but I was able to help him get the first ever translation of his Venice memoir, which was brought out by the Times Books. Here's Abel himself. He always signed off on his emails with un abrazo, a hug. But yeah, he was a very nice, passionate man, and very encouraging to me about my writing, even though he didn't speak much English and I don't speak much Spanish, so we sort of sent Google translations in our correspondence. But this was translated by George Henson, and I thought it was not only a great portrait of the city, but also a portrait of living abroad as an expat, because Abel was a diplomat. He lived in various countries, including, of course, here, beautiful, mythological Venice, Italy. And also, Borges makes an appearance. And you know, whenever Borges makes an appearance, things are going to get weird in a good way, deep, philosophical, and even funny. So whether it was the fictional Borges who appeared in this, or the real Borges, or some incarnation in between, who can tell for sure? But this is a nice read. I wish it had gone more into his personal life, maybe even more about the city as a whole, but there are great moments of poetry and other characters beyond Borges appear. So I would recommend this as well if you have any interest in the experience of an expat, I should say, or any interest in Venice. So speaking of beautiful, iconic cities, The Names by Don DeLillo is the next on my list. I tried reading this a couple years ago, and honestly, despite DeLillo being one of my absolute favorite authors who has never really let me down in any sizable way, I mean, Cosmopolis wasn't the best thing ever, but I still found enough in there to appreciate The Names. I couldn't finish, but then when I was in Greece and had a beautiful kind of front row view of the Acropolis down the street from where I was staying, I started reading The Names again, because what better way to do it than in the country that this is set in, his Greek novel, where he stayed in Greece, lived in Greece for several years. Look at that brooding artist with his beard. Yeah, Greece did something to him. He said he wanted to create a prose that mimicked the carving into stone that you see in the ancient tablets, and gravestones, and buildings across Greece. And also learning the Greek alphabet was like learning the alphabet all over again, the original alphabet. And that helped him with this. But still, even though I had a better experience reading it this time in full, it still is not my favorite, and I think partly because it's dialogue heavy, very dialogue heavy, whereas I just love his prose proper. And yeah, that was one of the criticisms I have. Not really a criticism, just more of an aesthetic preference, let's say, but there is a lot going on in here, and the book begs rereading, so I'll probably revisit this again sometime and hopefully get even more out of it. The next is more nonfiction, Conversations with American Writers, all conducted by Charles Ruas, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And the writers interviewed include Toni Morrison, Gore Vidal, Susan Sontag, Robert Stone, Paul Theroux, who I was lucky enough to interview at the Kaleidoscope, Truman Capote, Scott Spencer, Eudora Welty, E.L. Doctorow, Tennessee Williams, Norman Mailer, Joseph Heller, William Burroughs, and most magical of all, Marguerite Young, who also has some kind of Bruno Schulz-esque fanciful ideas about reality, and those are some of the most interesting people to talk to. So her interview was a standout, but a lot of these interviews I think were great and just revealed a lot, not only about the authors themselves and their works, but also the writing life in general, the artistic view of life in general. So if you can track this down, it's a good read and probably a good resource too, especially if you're doing anything related to the authors who are featured in this title. So the next is Kodon by Areshi Young. The publisher, Calamari Archive, reached out to me saying, you know, you've published one of Areshi's stories in the Kaleidoscope, and one of those stories is published in this collection. So he asked me if I would review it, and I agreed, and I wrote a review of it, and it's currently in a competition. So whether I win or not, well, if I win it, then it'll be published in a specific place, which I'll tell you about later if it happens. And if not, it'll be published in the Kaleidoscope. But until then, here is my telling you that this book is Borgesian to the core. Sometimes abstrusely so, densely so. But when it's not too dense, it reaches a kind of imaginative height that is very rare to find in literature. So that alone makes this not only worth a read, but an admirable accomplishment, especially as the first full-length book, I believe that this is. But I'll put a link, if I can remember, I'll put a link to the story in the Kaleidoscope so you can get a taste of Areshi Young's very unique and bold, I should say, prose style and ideas. Thank you, Calamari Archive, for sending me a copy. So I finished this video and realized I forgot to mention 2 books because I don't own those books anymore. I sold them at my bookstore on Instagram, the Kaleidoscope Books Store. So the 5th best book I read, you'll just have to imagine it, this beautiful 2-volume box set hardcover of Jeanette Frame's works. And I'm specifically referring to the 2nd volume titled Snowman, Snowman, which is full of these short, surreal short stories that, but they're particularly short, sometimes only 1 or half a page or a few pages long, but always with this kind of Borgesian slant to looking at the world that I found delightful. But I will say the title story is a novella, Snowman, Snowman, from the perspective of the snowman who was birthed into existence by kids and is trying to hang on to existence and is learning about the world during the season of winter. But of course, spring will come, the sun will come, the heat will come, and then he has to not only learn about the concept of death, but then in some way accept it. So it was beautiful, and her prose is a bit on the sparse side, which is usually not my forte, but she makes it work. So she's a New Zealand writer, and I'm definitely prepared to seek out more of her work, especially her novels, which is my preferred form. Now, this is some more nonfiction. I just had better luck with nonfiction this year. Shrapnel by Lance Olson. This was sent to me by Anti-Oedipus Press. They were asking about people interested in saying something about this, and I've enjoyed Lance Olson's novels, my favorite being his Vincent van Gogh novel. Gogh. What was the title? See if I can see it on the shelf. Head in Flames. That was my favorite, but I could also recommend Skin Elegies, and you can't really go wrong with any of his works. I still have plenty more to read. Dream Lives of Debris was another good one. If anything, his works are too short. I want them to last longer and be 2 or 3 times or 4 times the length. But in this, Shrapnel, it collects interviews and essays, not only about the novel as a form, but also the future of books, the future of art, and it gets in depth, let's say, almost, again, to the point of becoming too dense at times, so the pieces beg rereading. But there were a lot of great observations in this, lots to chew on, lots of questions raised, more questions than answers, but who has the answers these days, or any days? But Shrapnel, I would recommend this for anybody who is interested in innovative, or let's say experimental fiction. But also, he mentions Borges, the work of Borges, Kafka, Donald Bartholomew, Steve Tomasula, another great writer, Kathy Acker, and even David Foster Wallace. I think he touches on some of his work. So there's a lot in here. You'll get plenty of bang for your buck. And it's a small press, so always good to support them. And the second novel that I forgot to talk about that I also sold on my bookstore is Dirtmouth by Alan Singer, the third best book I read this year. It's part of a kind of violence, I believe, trilogy that's connected thematically. So you can read them in any order. And they're starting to get more and more hard to find. But Dirtmouth, just the prose alone is so serpentine and irregular in the best way possible. And so even if the story was not good, and it is good, you're carried along, or at least I was, by the prose, which it's hard to compare it to anything, but I guess there's a kind of Letzian essence to some of the sentences, and Cormac McCarthyan essence to some of the other longer sentences. But Singer is certainly in a class of his own. And but as far as the story, Dirtmouth is about archaeologists, specifically those who dig up mummies, and it gets extremely dark and morbid the more you go in, because there's also a kind of murder mystery interrogation happening, a kind of triumvirate of voices about what has happened, why it has happened, how it has happened. So that mystery can also kind of guide the reader along. But just a beautiful book, and made me want to get the last in that violence trilogy. I was able to find a copy. The last one that haven't read is Memory Wax. The other one that I have read is called The Charnel Imp, and that I wrote a review of on the Kaleidoscope. But I was so, I guess, enamored with this book, especially after having such a dry year of dry prose and dry books that I didn't really care about, that I called Alan up, because I have interviewed him before on not only my podcast, but on the site as a text interview, so 2 different projects. I called him. I hadn't heard from him in a while, but just told him how much I loved Dirtmouth, and to thank him for such a rich reading experience when I needed it most. And he tells me he cannot find a publisher for The Seahorse, the fiction collective 2, which FC2, which has been a home for many of his books over the years, rejected it. And other publishers have rejected it. And that he's just struggling, like all of us, to find, a home for his work, to find the support that he deserves. But he was kind enough to send me the manuscript, and I will be publishing an excerpt of his latest work, The Seahorse, on the Kaleidoscope. So be on the lookout for that, and it'll be an honor to feature his new work exclusively on the Kaleidoscope. So the second best book I read this year is Film as Film, the collected writings of Gregory J. Markopoulos, an avant-garde filmmaker to the core. And I was able to grab a copy, the only hardcover copy of this I could find, on eBay ahead of my attending one of the rarest film screenings on planet Earth, a section of one of the longest films ever made, Enniaios. It's hard to pronounce. It's Greek. I should know. I'm learning. But the event is called Temenos, and it takes place, this film screening, in Arcadia, and lasts almost a week. And it's very hard to get into, very exclusive, basically the cinephile's pilgrimage. Wonderful time. Beautiful location that they've scouted. You see, Markopoulos was someone who wanted the absolute purity of his film, not to be let's say, soiled by the business aspect of art, or the political, social aspect, and all the other hoops and things that people are forced to go through. Instead, he did and made what he wanted, and in this you'll have reviews of other avant-garde films, criticism of other avant-garde films, but also what you could describe as manifestos describing his ideas of the ultimate art. And many of these manifestos really go into the stuff of poetry. That they become so kind of abstract, let's say, but sort of grounded by poetic language relating to, say, the site where Temenos is, and other things of that nature, literally nature. But I did meet Markopoulos's partner, the filmmaker Robert Beavers, and got him to sign it. And he writes, "A life collected in these writings, R.B. Robert Beavers." Robert Beavers is a phenomenal filmmaker in and of himself. So, if you haven't heard of Markopoulos or Beavers, this actually can act as a kind of primer to not only avant-garde cinema, but also the life and ideas of Markopoulos and his partner Beavers, who is quoted heavily throughout this entire book, because they formed a kind of power couple of filmmakers, artists, and Markopoulos, being the older of the two, kind of still looked up to Beavers as a muse. So yes, I will be writing a very in-depth, or I hope what will be an in-depth essay on my experience of attending Temenos, and of course informed by this definitive collection. And then the best book, did I say book? The best book I read this year is one that you'll be hard-pressed to find anywhere. And it's The Devil to Pay in the Backlands by, I won't try to say his whole name and embarrass myself, but Rosa. This is actually for sale on the Kaleidoscope Books Instagram, where I sell rare, new and used and rare, beautiful titles. This is for sale for a very good price, considering what some of the other ones are going for online. But now there has been some controversy as to the fidelity of the translation. However, even though the prose is on the plainer side, mark my words, even with plain prose, the story, which is epic in scope, which is suffused with sensorial detail, and packed with interesting characters and situations, so that makes up for some lackluster prose. Yet the prose does have its moments, don't get me wrong. This isn't, I would not call this a terrible translation. I would say suitable. And grateful to have it available in English, even though it is hard to come by. And doesn't Rosa kind of look like Tom Hanks? Maybe there's a biopic waiting to happen here. Anyway, I've written an essay on this. It's not out yet. Maybe out in a month or so. But in the meantime, if you want to read this beauty, send me a message on Kaleidoscope Books Instagram, and I'd be happy to sell you the copy. I will say though that this has been compared to Ulysses and called the Brazilian Ulysses, and spoiler alert, that is hyperbole. Doesn't even make any sense whatsoever. In fact, I would say the closest thing I could compare it to is Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. except the difference, of course, one of the main differences is the prose. McCarthy's prose is incredible. This prose is suitable. So don't go in thinking that, but do think of a kind of Brazilian Western, because it's about groups of bandits trying to survive in the scrublands, the wastelands, just the all-out wilds of the Brazilian outback, as it were. So, and it is written in the first person, so that kind of limits what the prose can do, but this still is an amazing novel, and it's number one of 2024 for me. So take that for what it is, and thank you for listening. And at the very least, I'll see you at the end or around the end of 2025 to tell you my next top 10 if I don't make any other videos. We'll see. But again, thanks for listening and take care.